A patient's prescribed dose is 4,500 centigrade. The patient is prescribed 180 centigrade per fraction for a total of 25 fractions at 100 cm SSD. What dose would the patient receive if they were accidentally treated at 90 cm SSD for one fraction? So this has a lot of information, and let's try to unpack it to see what kind of calculation we need to do. So some things that we know. The prescribed dose is 4,500 centigrade. The dose per fraction is 180 centigrade, and there are 25 fractions. And the distance is 100. Now, the key words here are accidentally treated. So that means there was a dose error or an error in setup. And that error was that the patient was treated at the wrong SSD, and that's 90 cm SSD instead of 100, which was the prescribed distance. So whenever we are discussing dose and distance, we need to think about using the inverse square formula. On the other hand, if it was a field size and a distance, it would be a direct proportion. So in this case, because we're trying to determine what a new dose would be based on distance, we need to know the inverse square law. So this question is asking about one single fraction. Originally, we're given the total dose, and then we're given the single fraction dose. So we're going to utilize 180 centigrade instead of 4,500 centigrade. Now, how can we think about this question before we even start solving? So our radiation comes out of the source in this triangular fashion. When the dose is close to the source, it's much stronger. As it travels further, it's spread out over a longer area or wider area, so the dose is less strong. And to determine how strong it is, we use the inverse square law. Now, it's tricky to determine which intensity goes with which distance when you're using the total inverse square law formula, so I'm going to show you a shortcut. So the patient was prescribed at 100 cm, but they were accidentally treated at 90. So the patient is closer to the source than prescribed. When the patient is closer, that means that they're getting an overdose. So since they're getting an overdose, we know our answer is going to be something greater than 180 centigrade. But we need to determine how much more it's going to be. So here's how I do it. Once there's an overdose, we need to determine our formula. We're going to use the inverse square formula with the greater number on top. Now, which numbers are we going to use? So we're going to use our distances to determine our inverse square factor. So first, our distance, that's 190. The bigger number or greater number is 100. So I'm going to do 100 over 90. And I'm going to square these because this is an inverse square law question. So we always square the distances. So if I use my calculator and I do 100 divided by 90, I get 1.11. Once I square it, I get 1.235. I'll round it. That means the patient is receiving 1.235 times more dose. We can solve this question now by multiplying our original dose And that gets us to 222 centigrade for that one single fraction. Now, if the question were to ask you a total dose based on all of the fractions being treated at 90 cm SSD, then we would use the 4500. Because it's specifically asking for one fraction, we only need to use a single fraction dose. Questions like this also might ask you what is the percentage of dose. So if the patient were to receive 180 centigrade, that would be 100% of the dose. But we can use this number here to find our percentage. This is a decimal. If we multiply it by 100%, we would get 123.5%. So this is an overdose. They're getting more than 100, but how much more? Now let's just subtract 100, and we're going to get 23.5%. So this patient was treated at an overdose of 23.5%. And those are the two major ways these questions can be asked.